Well, hello everyone. On the podcast, the Big L podcast episode that I had uploaded to this channel that was entitled Abortion and the Libertarian Conscience, I had an excellent comment by Danny Meeks, and I kept meaning to respond to it, and I didn't have time to write this out or that out, and writing sometimes can just take me forever, other than blah, 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 blabbing. So I decided if I'm going to respond to this eventually, I'd better just do it as a video. Thus, this particular clip. And I haven't planned anything out. I'll only do edits where maybe I really mess up, but this is going to be my pretty much contemporaneous response to his comments. So we got to put on the glasses in order to read the comment. And I'm going to try to keep my head so that the ring light's not right in the middle of it when I need to wear my glasses. And the screen over here is where I have the comment, so I've got to turn my head that way. So this actually was an entire thread. So I'm going to read his first comment, my response, and then the comment that he last left that I'm intending to respond to. So Danny said, I guess I don't understand how on a previous episode you proclaim yourself an anarchist, but on this one you defend the right of the state to prohibit abortion within an article you wrote and linked to in the notes. I'm curious how you justify the dichotomy of these two positions. Keep in mind, I'm not promoting or defending either position. And here was my initial answer. I'm glad to answer. In my article, I'm very careful not to defend a state, but whatever entity or service is protecting rights. I quote, as libertarians, we generally believe that the state, or in an anarchist view, the community law, however enforced or enacted, does have a compelling reason to prevent and punish homicide. And that was in the main part of the article, and in footnote number 2, I said I hold to an voluntarist anarchist view. I prefer my state non-existent. I went on to say there will always be the protection of rights, i.e. governance, but government is not equal to the state. Also, in any discussion, one must work within the reality that presently exists, even though we might prefer a drastically different one. Atheism is by necessity a philosophical exercise, as the state is near impossible to avoid. So now I'm going to read Danny's final response and interact with it as I read it. And I'll try to be very clear as to when he's speaking. So Danny says, interesting view. A few points though. Anarchism at its core is simply without rulers, while small l libertarianism is not so much a political ideology, but a philosophical statement that all human interactions be voluntary. With that said, if anarchist communities did exist, there would be many different varieties depending on the beliefs of the individuals involved. I'm not so sure I would agree that small l libertarianism is not a political ideology at its core. Yes, it's a philosophical statement that all human interactions be voluntary, but human interactions, the minute you start dealing with more than one person, you're dealing with politics. You're dealing with politics is the way communities and people work together in a very broad sense. Maybe you're defining politics a little bit more precisely, so not so sure if we disagree there. But of course, yes, it is a philosophical statement that all human interactions be voluntary. And Big L libertarianism has the same thing, but it does explicitly work within the American political system. But even if it were not working within the American political system, it still would be a political philosophy, at least in my view, unless I'm misunderstanding your points here. He said, with that said, if anarchist communities did exist, there would be many different varieties. Absolutely. That's the beauty of it, because if everyone can voluntarily agree to whatever situation they wish, they can have it. You can voluntarily agree to give up some of your rights. So that's entirely possible. I'm not really sure how that countered what I said. Maybe the point Danny is trying to say, there might be some communities that view abortion as something to be prohibited and other communities that don't. Absolutely, I would not disagree there. He goes on to say, if this is a philosophical argument, then you would have to include not only ANCAP communities, but also ANCOM, ANSOC, etc. And I believe I did with the comment I had just stated, that the communities will have their own agreed upon mores. But on the other hand, I don't think I need to do that, because I am specifically coming from a big L libertarian perspective. Everything I say is going to be filtered through that. And ANCOM, ANSOC, none of that is compatible with big L libertarianism, though it may be in the small L libertarian movement. So within the context that I'm dealing with, I don't think I need to. But I also don't think that's particularly relevant here, because again, even within ANCAP communities, there would be people who disagree on this issue, and there would be community mores which may differ from community to community. Danny continues, the only prerequisites would be that no person may rule over another. Many of those communities may not even acknowledge the existence of natural rights, more than likely being collectivist in nature. Now, here is where we start to disagree and things get really interesting. But let me continue to make his entire point before I respond. All of this is within the rules, so to speak, as long as aggression is not used to coerce another into joining or staying within said community. There would be no logical reason that any anarchist community would be required to punish those who have abortions other than your insistence that this must be so. It is entirely up to the citizens how they set the rules in order to be a part of said community. So to make the statement that there will always be a protection of rights is not factually correct, except within your own predetermined scenario. That is what anarchism is about. Okay, there's some disagreement and some agreement, and I think most of it is solved by the fact that I am operating within a big L libertarian framework, which would presuppose natural rights. Big L libertarian philosophy is at its core deontological, so it presupposes natural rights. So as far as communities that do not acknowledge the existence of natural rights, as long as everyone agreed upon that, they can certainly do that. But that doesn't mean natural rights still don't exist. You can not acknowledge something, but reality is reality. And even if collectivist in nature, they do acknowledge some kind of right. They may ground it differently. They may ground it in utilitarianism or some other philosophy. But each community will believe in some kind of rights. And then he goes on to say that this is perfectly fine as long as aggression is not used, but you cannot know what aggression is unless you know what rights are. So they will definitely have some particular view of rights. And then he says that I insist that anarchist communities would be required to punish those who have abortions. I did not say that. I had merely said it is possible. If said community views abortion as homicide, it is a legitimate defense of rights to prohibit it as homicide. But if they don't view it as homicide and it is not clear, then not. All I am saying is if they do hold that view, it is consistent then to treat it similarly and to use defensive force to prevent, prohibit, punish whatever types of scenario we might be dealing with. So the statement that there will always be a protection of rights is not factually incorrect. In every system, including ANCOM, ANSOC, whatever, there will always be a protection of rights. Their conception of rights may be different, but they will have a conception of rights, even if it's merely group rights, in which then the punishment would be against the individual who was claiming something in detriment to the group. And when you said, as long as aggression is not used to coerce another into joining or staying within said community, this is where things get interesting. If you accept as just as legitimate a different conception of rights, and their conception of rights is that there are no individuals, that there is only the community, the whole idea of aggression being used against an individual to keep them in a community is a completely nonsensical idea. They would have no conception of that. So in order to even make this point, you are presupposing natural rights because you're presupposing that forcing somebody to stay in a community would be aggression. And in certain philosophies, it wouldn't be. But again, we're not getting that far into the weeds as we are talking about big L libertarianism. He continues, now if we are to imagine a libertarian anarchist community, and he did small l, and I'd have to say my imagination is big L. And big L meaning the philosophy to which the Libertarian Party holds. We would combine the two statements, no one may rule over another, and all human interactions be voluntary. Absolutely. I agree. In no way does this preclude any type of governing body. Absolutely. I agree. In fact, I would say some type of governing body is inevitable. He continues, that is not to say that one cannot exist within a libertarian society, only that it must be voluntarily funded, and if one chooses not to follow the government or its edicts, they would be left to live their life in peace. Yes, absolutely, except if there is natural rights that are violated, that particular governing body would have the right to enforce them, even against someone who doesn't acknowledge or who doesn't support, let's say, that particular government, because what they are enforcing is something that's universal. It does not depend upon someone's agreement, because if it depended upon someone's agreement, there would be no such thing as aggression. There has to be things that are universal norms in order to have universal ideas of aggression. It cannot be a floating abstraction. He goes on, regarding labeling abortion with the legal term homicide, then it logically follows that we must also label miscarriages as manslaughter, whether involuntary or negligent, depending on the circumstances. I personally believe for this reason, homicide would not be the proper term and abortion is sufficient. You're reading too, now, excuse me, my response, you're reading too much into my use of the word homicide as a legal term of art. I do not mean it as a legal term of art. I mean it as aggression against a person who has not aggressed, let's put it, lethal aggression against another person who has not aggressed in such a way that would justify it. So it'd be unjustified lethal aggression. We can say that instead of homicide. I'm not using it as a legal term of art. He continues, as to your statement, also in any discussion, one must work within the reality that presently exists, even though we might prefer a drastically different one. We both know that this is not correct when having a discussion based on philosophy. I do not agree, because again, I am speaking of big L libertarianism as a Libertarian Party member. And as a Libertarian Party member, I have to always keep in mind the system that we have now. If I am ever having a purely philosophical discussion that will not take into account the system as we have now, I will make that very, very explicit. And I was not doing so in this discussion. He says, you are referring to an argument based on practicality. Yes, in politics, you do have to do that. If this were the case, then discussions of anarchism, not to mention libertarianism, would be entirely irrelevant, as we both know that more than likely a state will always exist in one form or another, so why bother even having this conversation? I do not believe it is likely that a state will always exist in one form or another. So that's why I have that conversation. I can't speak for why you would have that conversation, but I do not think a state will always exist. If I thought a state would always exist, I would not bother with politically trying to move towards a more voluntary society. I do think a government will always exist, but a government is not the same thing as a state, which I believe you conceded earlier, Danny. Continuing with his point. The reason is because no argument regarding anarchism or libertarianism is based on working within the reality that currently exists. Yes, it does. You are conflating endgame with how to get there. In order to get there, you have to deal with the system that presently exists. He continues, in fact, the opposite is true. Anarchism and libertarianism are alternatives to our current reality, alternatives that anarchists and/or libertarians believe to be more just than the current system. And so we are passionate about spreading these ideas so that others may stand and take notice, and maybe, just maybe, our current society can benefit from them. That is one reason, absolutely. But in bringing in our current society may benefit from them, you just acknowledged the reality that currently exists. You even had to do that in arguing for the usefulness of a purely philosophical discussion. So I really don't think we disagree much. There might be a little bit of talking past each other, but I hope I explained my position a little better and that this is helpful to Danny or anyone else who may have similar questions. Thank you so much and have an awesome day.